So, Balaji Srinivasan, right? So you sent this
Yes.
really cool link, and about this again, this tech elite dude, an Asian American,
Mhm.
so many of them in the Bay
Yeah.
Area, um, who is imagining, in his terms, kind of like akin to a Zionist dream of the Bay Area, devoid of working people, racialized people, et cetera, et cetera. Any subject that is not like one of their kind, like another, investor in training, another person who's going to be a part of this professional managerial class, or this investor class, or this ruling class.
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
Trung Nguyen is a friend who teaches ethnic studies and Asian American studies at San Jose State. And when we were in Puerto Rico for the American Studies Association conference last year, Trung was on a panel organized by friend of the pod, Erin McElroy. And the panel was called Techno-Capitalism, Anti-Communism, and Techno-Fascism in Late Stage U.S. Empire and Beyond. And Trung's part of the discussion covered how Vietnamese Americans whose families had been refugees here in the U.S. were offering housing to refugees from Afghanistan after the U.S. mostly pulled out our military in 2021, and how Airbnb.org, which is Airbnb's nonprofit arm, was making it all possible. It's a great marketing scheme for Airbnb because these refugee landlords were willingly being used as evidence that the American dream involving the entrepreneurial spirit and owning property or multiple properties is still alive and attainable thanks to Airbnb. And the way that Trung told the story and will tell the story covers a lot of the things that are often discussed on this here podcast, including landlords, Asians, and the US doing evil shit in other parts of the world. So if you listen to the episode in full, you'll learn about that, but you also get to learn about what romantic anti-capitalism is and find out if you too live in a hyperghetto. Thank you to everyone subscribed at patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which is where you should go right now if you want to support this podcast, which, like anything worth doing in life, is not a money magnet by any means, but by subscribing there, you'll help to pay the editor, Tyger, and cover things like software subscriptions and space for future live events next time we do one. Thank you to everyone who subscribes and makes my life slightly easier. Trung, welcome to the podcast. It was going to happen eventually, and I'm glad that it finally did.
I'm so happy I'm here. Thanks for having me.
So to start, what drew you to research and write about refugee landlords?
Yeah, so my big projects that I've been working on for quite a long time is just about refugees and the rhetorical usages by different states, and generally these people moving projects. The United States in particular is a really interesting case study for looking at refugees and for looking at general people moving projects, because it shifts a lot according to whether the United States is attempting to claim global hegemony at a certain time. Because for most of the world, at least in what we consider under modernity, people moving projects and refugees, these mass people displacement projects, and the people who are being displaced are not seen very favorably, and there's like never really an attempt to frame them in some kind of ideologically favorable way. The United States, especially after World War II, tried to frame refugees and people coming out of these mass displacements, especially in the aftermath of World War II, for its ideological purposes, for anti-communist purposes in particular. I can go more into that, but that was really what was interesting to me, because I'm a descendant of this diaspora, right? So I'm Vietnamese American. My parents are survivors of the war generation from the Vietnam War. And, I grew up in a very large Vietnamese ethnic enclave, ethnic community. And I was surrounded by a lot of this rhetoric that didn't make any sense to me about refugees and about Vietnamese people because it didn't really align with what I had growing up. So, I'd see these like news articles and representations of, oh, these refugees being super successful, these refugees doing incredible things in the United States. And like everyone around me was like, incarcerated in gangs or like dying on the streets or something. So for me, that just kind of seeded like a very long interest in understanding how do refugees, these mass people moving projects, these mass displacements get absorbed by different states for their ideological purposes.
Could you just sort of sum up what this paper is about?
Yeah, so this piece that I'm working on, or have been working on for a while, tries to examine what happens when refugees have been ideologically deployed to recuperate or paper over the contradictions of housing crisis. And in the United States, in particular, the refugees, specifically the Vietnamese refugees, especially attractive subject to do this because they were a subject or population that themselves were displaced, so rendered homeless. So, what happens when a subject that was once without home is now doing something to quote unquote provide housing for others? It's an incredibly seductive narrative, which covers over the fact that, well, housing has been rendered precarious and commodified and enclosed out of reach for vast majority of many, right? And so I think what's interesting about that story to me in the piece that I'm working on is not just how refugee landlords, specifically Vietnamese refugee landlords, reproduce these ideas, whether willingly or unwillingly, but also how this whole dynamic unfolds out to and speaks to larger conversations around neoliberalism and capitalism, around housing and ideologies of what shelter is and should be. And so, what these all relate to is things like the ideology of the fortress in the Bay Area. It's like how, and the imagination of the world as a hyperghetto. It's this imagination of, well, we are going to create a utopia for some people, right? And force everyone else, all these surplus populations, into other places. And as our planetary crisis gets worse and worse through different environmental, ecological destabilizations, different socially produced emergencies erupts, the need for shelter becomes increasingly important, as it always has been. And so there's an attempt to enclose it away from people to render them even more precarious and exploitable. And so the imaginations of housing in the contemporary moment, especially exported out of Silicon Valley, aka the Bay Area, as a capitalist reservoir, is that the world should be a hyper ghetto. And that is kind of what they are trying to put in place. But that is not the imaginary and ideology that they're putting forth. So what's really important in this conversation and this piece for me to kind of untangle some of those fantasies to kind of help us understand, okay, well, what's really at the heart of reproducing this structural relationship.
And yeah, I mean, thank you for writing about this like very niche, but like very, very Bay Area, very I mean it's as I mentioned earlier, off record, it's super up the alley of this podcast, like about how people are kind of folded into the neoliberal state. And you also, in this particular piece that we're speaking about, you give some really good thoughts around emerging, I would say, terms that people are using when talking about neoliberalism and talking about the imperialism in the modern day. And I thought we could start by defining some of these terms for people. First, wondering if you could explain what is romantic anti-capitalism?
Yeah, so romantic anti-capitalism. So I'll first talk about how I just came across that and what was interesting to that about me, for me in particular. So this my particular era of work that I'm working on is, as you mentioned, about refugee landlords, right? And as I talked about a little bit earlier, I was generally interested in the ideological usages of refugees, especially in the United States, because it's such a unique case compared to other places in the world, which historically saw refugees as, pure labor sources or a project to as a scapegoat or someone to be demonized. Or encouraging the creation of refugee populations in order to excise a particular community, right? So you see this, for example, the Zionist project in the early 20th century. And for me, the way that refugees get enfolded into the neoliberal state, landlords become a huge ideological point to enable that process to happen. Because landlords, especially refugee landlords in the United States, get framed as, oh wow, these are people who've made it, right? These are people who have done, who've come from absolutely nothing and devastation, and now they're living the American dream, right? It's this fiction of this American dream through participation in the speculative, commodified housing. And so to me, I was trying to make sense of, okay, how is housing thought about? How are refugees thought about? How is housing seen, and landlordery in particular, seen as like a quote unquote gift, right? How does it get framed as a gift being bestowed upon other people, which completely covers over the fact that, the entire landlord relation is premised on expropriation and violence. And so this very neoliberal mechanism, I was trying to make sense of how does this get framed as like a gift. And so romantic anti-capitalism was one of the ways that I was able to kind of make those connections. So romantic anti-capitalism, what is it? There are many different genealogies and ways that the phrasing is used, and it refers to different things. And those things don't always align. So for example, there is a branch of using the term romantic anti-capitalism to actually describe very interesting critiques of capitalism coming from the Romanticist tradition of aesthetics and thought and literature, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one branch of it, which is not the branch that I'm using in particular. I just want to make that clear. The branch of romantic anti-capitalism that I'm using is coming from Iyko Day's work in Alien Capital. So in this book, she examines how Asian racialization operates in the context of settler colonialism in North America in particular. So meaning, how is Asianness created as a race? Under what social conditions and social relations does Asianness come to mean something? And this is not eternal, obviously. This is very historically situated, and she tracks all these different transformations. And romantic anti-capitalism becomes one way for her in this book to think about some of the weird things that are happening with Asian racialization. So I'll go into that for a second, but let me just define romantic anti-capitalism in this version in particular. So romantic anti-capitalism is a viewpoint which believes that the world, or sees the world specifically underneath capitalism, as between two irreconcilable forces, right? And that is one force of concrete kind of work and labor. So these are things you can feel, you can touch. This is like a guy, making a jar or something for his house. That's the concrete. And then that is diametrically opposed in the romantic anti-capitalist viewpoint to the abstract parts of the world. And this, under capitalism, this would be money, finance, stocks. These are the immaterial, the things that seem imaginary, that you can't really touch, right? But yet seem to exert a force in the way that we live, and exert a force in how we relate to one another. And so the romantic anti-capitalist viewpoint believes that those two things are separate, and that all of the violence of capitalism is only coming from these immaterial abstract forces like money and stocks and finance, and these shadowy things going on behind the scenes, and that we should all return to this world of just doing like concrete labor and get rid of stocks, et cetera, et cetera. So
Trades,
it's
yeah,
like that.
go back to the trades and tune out.
Yeah, kind of like that. And so what the problem with that is, okay, so that it romanticizes. That's the romantic part, right? It romanticizes that particular idea, and the anti-capitalist part comes from the fact that these viewpoints believe that returning to those things is a way to like undo capitalism, right? Right, that's what that is. The problem with this viewpoint, or what it misrecognizes, is that this viewpoint presumes that those two things are fundamentally separated. That just returning to these, like, the trades or whatever, these concrete things will undo capitalism. But that's not necessarily the case, at least in this viewpoint, or at least in the critique of it, or if you read some Marx, he explains that the entire capitalist relation is premised on a dynamic relationship between the concrete and these abstract things. Like, you need the concrete things in order to create these abstract things, and vice versa. So you can't really separate it. You can't undo capitalism unless you undo the heart of the capitalist relationship, which is undoing relations of alienation and commodification, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. You can see how, like, the American dream would kind of fit in there as like a, in the iconography of romantic capitalism, romantic anti-capitalism. What next is a hyperghetto, and how does it produce refugee landlords and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so the hyperghetto idea. So this is also super interesting to me in the piece as well, or in understanding these relations between refugees and landlords, and that whole thing. So the hyperghetto was termed and thought about and popularized by Loic Wacquant and Eric Tang. And Eric Tang writes about it in the context of Cambodian refugees in New York City who are living in what he refers to as hyperghettos. And hyperghettos is best understood by distinguishing it from the traditional ghetto, right? And so when we talk about these terms, we also firstly have to separate the idea of the ghetto, the imaginary of the ghetto, and all the ways it circulates in popular culture and its uses, versus its usage as a term to distinguish between particular geographical sites and locations and the relations therein, right? So firstly, we just have to separate those things, just to make things easier for us to understand, because the ghetto as an idea is like a whole separate set of things, right? So thinking about the hyperghetto, I'm thinking about it in terms of a particular geographical space that's defined by particular kinds of relations, right? So for both the traditional ghetto and the hyperghetto, they're both defined as racially segregated geographic areas, urban spaces in particular. And these places are racially segregated and class segregated usually as a result of either social exclusions, structural forms of social death, or legal and political forms of exclusion. So in whatever context, both the traditional ghetto and the hyperghetto are institutionally separated out, usually from whiteness. And the point of that is to separate out these communities in order to prevent them from, intruding upon the rest of whiteness in whatever geographical space or urban community that you're in, right? So there's that. Now, the difference between the traditional ghetto and the hyperghetto is that the traditional ghetto, if we just simply understand it as a site that is segregated out spatially, socially, economically, and so forth, there are still economies going on there. There's still some form of capital investment happening, whether it is through the community members themselves or through external forms. There's still quite a bit of formal economy stuff happening. So you'll see, like, boba shops, restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see it defined also by some amounts of free labor waged movement happening. So meaning these are people who are working either in or out of these traditional ghettos, right? And the difference with the hyper ghetto, as understood by Wacquant and Eric Tang, is that these are really sites of confinement. These are places where there is no formal work. It is defined by primarily informal economies. You have sex work, you have drugs, et cetera, or anything else that people need to do to make ends meet. And you see the emergence of hyperghettos become more and more proliferated as the US economy has become more and more bifurcated, as social safety nets are destroyed completely, as more of the US population, especially targeted or separated out or stratified by race, class, gender, and sexuality, um, there are more surplus populations being invented as capital leaves the United States or transforms into something that serves as the global elite. So, Wakan and Tang really see the hyperghetto as an urban site or a place, a geographical concentration where it operates almost like a containment site for surplus populations, for people who cannot or have been dispossessed of the conditions of living and making ends meet and reproducing themselves and each other. So, we're seeing more and more of those become the norm in different parts of the United States.
Yeah, and I'm talking to you from the Tenderloin, and I think this place would probably be, fall under that definition pretty well in terms of like, for all the wealth that is around us, the 80-some billionaires in San Francisco. Most people, not most people necessarily, but like a lot of people in the TL living in public housing, they're getting government benefits, not, like the traditional American dream is far, far out of reach. And, I know personally, I am in my 242 square foot place until I die, most likely, here. And it's a little bit different from like a place without a hyperghetto in the Bay Area. I was thinking might be like Mill Valley, which is fancy place known for its like film festival. Still close enough to where like you could probably commute if you had to come into the office in San Francisco. But it also like has a problem with there is, from the perspective of the rich residents there, service industry, like first responders, teachers can't afford to live in Mill Valley. So Mill Valley is like trying to get people to who just have vacation homes in Mill Valley, rent them out to local teachers. They like started a new program late last year around this. There's no threat of any hyper-ghetto coming to be in Mill Valley anytime soon. But it would seem that more and more, even as like the tech elite are trying to build large projects where it's just rich people. They're trying to do this in Solano County recently, buying up a bunch of farmland to build a sort of like techno utopian village. But one question was always like, how separate do you want the classes in this imagined utopia to be? And the answer is they want them as separate as they can be. Anyway, that was a tangent. How does the hyperghetto produce refugee landlords?
Yeah. Well, just to comment really quickly on what you said, I totally don't think it was a tangent. That was super helpful context, to kind of what we're seeing in the Bay Area, especially, is an attempt to turn it into a fortress, right? So this fortress ideology, which is extremely and rooted in ethno-nationalism, the creation of the ethno-state. You see people like Elon Musk trying to attempt to create a fortress kind of world, right? And what I mean by like a fortress ideology is the raising up of gates, the raising up of borders in order to protect and create like a utopia, and imagine a fictional utopia within, which is punctured through or undergirded by racist ideology. What they really want is, white folks in these fortresses and their Asian mistresses. So that's kind of what we're seeing with any of these utopia discourses. It is a fortress kind of discourse used by the tech elite, especially, and how it relates to the creation of the ghetto and the hyperghetto is the fortress has no place for the hyperghetto or the ghetto to exist or to have a place, and part of this is like it's a total delusion because the existence of the hyperghetto is a product of the structural flows of capital. It's a logical outcome of like how capitalism operates and exists. It requires, specifically racial capitalism, it requires the importation of a population that can be exploited. And so that is usually a racialized population, right? And when they use up this population, they're like, well, what now? And when this population gets used up because of the flight of capital or these neoliberal policies that are shifting what value accumulation looks like for them, it creates this community of people who are no longer, of use. So they become like existentially surplus at that point. And so to just warehouse these people, the hyper ghetto becomes a spatial solution to that. And so in a way, the hyper ghetto is very much so a cousin of the prison. It's a cousin of the it's a part of the carceral state because they're both just about warehousing. They're both about containing people. So one characteristic of the hyperghettos, you'll have a lot of public housing projects, very, very under-resourced, very, very neglected. And the people working in these places are doing what they can, right? But of course, and folks who are living in them are coming up with different important survival strategies to get through, which is, which could look like involvement in the informal economy in really important, critical ways. And so, yet at the same time, well, on top of those things, the hyperghetto is hyper policed, so people are contained in them to stay in them. So in a way, it's very similar. It's like a cousin of the prison because it's very carceral. But yeah, related.
Yeah,
to...
just thinking
Oh,
about, sorry, real quick. Yeah, like, I mean, immediately what jumps to mind is urban alchemy here. I don't know if they've spread to San Jose, but like in San Francisco, and you're up here often enough to have seen urban alchemy. You see them on the street. They're kind of like security guards. They're like another layer of policing around the city. Basically, they take people fresh from prison, give them sort of like security guard type jobs on the streets, and yeah, they act as kind of hall monitors around the Tenderloin, making sure that nobody lingers too long. The loiterers keep on down the road. But it is like this kind of, it is a way of keeping, I guess, surplus population from prisons sort of working and occupied. And I think the idea is to keep them from engaging in like risky activity. Anyways, it's like this newer phenomenon that is now spreading to other cities as like urban alchemy gets exported to other metro areas like Austin and Portland.
Right, exactly. I think urban alchemy is such a great example of how you're up around a hyperghetto, right? Because as you mentioned, it's very much so a cousin of, a kin of the police state, right? Urban Alchemy is a private company funded by public dollars in combination with a bunch of other, billionaires who are, want this private security force. And so it takes these folks who are formerly incarcerated, and these are vast majority of them. I probably like 99% of them are people of color, black and brown, and it frames itself as a very neoliberal multicultural solution. Oh, look, we are rehabilitating former incarcerated people. Oh, look, we're putting them to work in these communities they probably have some kind of familiarity in. But their whole purpose is to function akin to the police and policing without the same kind of regulations, laws, et cetera, et cetera. Not to say those things will, discipline the police whatsoever, but it's just another set of mechanisms that that they are, may or may not be accountable to. And so again, the existence of urban alchemy in different places as like a cousin of the police is a way to kind of be like, oh, look, we're defunding the police, but then we still have all these like, policing structures still available. Serves the function of keeping the people that those urban alchemy forces are occupying. It keeps those populations contained within them, right? So if the function of the hyperghetto is to discipline, to contain, to surveil newly surplus populations or historically surplus populations, then that's when wherever urban alchemy is deployed, you can probably know that you're in some kind of hyperghetto or hyperghetto in emergence. Balaji Srinivasan, right? So you sent this really cool link, and about this again, this tech elite dude, an Asian American, so many of them in the Bay Area, who is imagining, in his terms, kind of like akin to a Zionist dream of the Bay Area, devoid of working people, racialized people, et cetera, et cetera. Any subject that is not like one of their kind, like another, investor in training, another person who's going to be a part of this professional managerial class or this investor class or this ruling class, right? And so Srinivasan's imaginary is so common to all of these tech global elites who all over the world, especially in the United States. I mean, they're being pumped out like crazy here in the Bay Area because this is quote unquote the heart of the Silicon Valley. So it's a factory of this kind of ideology, but you see this everywhere all around as well. You see this happening in Asia, you see this happening in South Asia. But it's this imagination again of this kind of like fortress ideology where it's this creation of this idealized utopia that is fortified and policed and meant to serve these particular people. And the way they see themselves is very much so inspired by, and there's been some really cool articles on this out there, is really inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, actually. So like Lord of the Rings and this kind of sci-fi tech fantasy, high fantasy of warring states and warring feudal empires to destroy like an intruder. And you'll see all these various references to Lord of the Rings, like Palantir in these like tech elites.
It's like a symbol in the iconography of the books, Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. It's very much so a symbol of that. So these fortress ideologies that are being deployed in the Bay Area or just being factory produced like crazy through these articles and these conferences they get to talk at does have material impacts because they do fund and shape policies. They do fund and shape the movement of capital and the displacements of people. And it's inspired by Zionist thought, it's inspired by eugenicist thought, it's inspired by its racial thinking. It's the creation of an attempt at an ethno-state.
There will still, like, it doesn't get rid of this hyperghetto. Like the hyperghetto, they're like the quote unquote surplus population isn't going anywhere. They're not allowed inside the gates, or they don't want them in the gates unless they're there to do like service jobs. But at the end of the day, like there's like still like what these people like the Balajis of the world would consider surplus populations will still exist. And in these hyperghettos, there's still going to be people that are under US capitalism, being the landlords and being the entrepreneurs who are still seeking entrance into the gates. So the topic at hand with the paper that you gave at the American Studies Conference recently, you're talking specifically about refugee landlords. Let's kind of like switch away from some of the definitions and talk about Airbnb.org and how Airbnb sort of presents itself as a problem for low-income refugees and also a solution for those same people.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just writing some quick notes for myself. Okay. So I feel like I want to like quickly comment a few things, and then I'll get us right back on track because what
Yeah.
you're saying is so interesting. Can I do that really quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
This is
So,
podcast.
yeah, podcast world. Okay, so back to Srinivasan's imagination for this fortress, Silicon Valley, right? And you mentioned that there's this imaginary that there's going to be like, you know, just like no one who can enter these gates or whatever. And I think that's precisely like the conceit and the fiction of it. What they're saying out on the public stage is this fantasy, this new American dream, to kind of delude people into thinking they can be a part of entering these gates. And I think that's why these things get pumped up like crazy.
Totally.
It's getting pumped out like crazy so people can believe in this fiction to produce themselves as these neoliberal subjects when really what they are is a surplus subject or to be surplus
Yeah, no,
subject.
like things like
but it's the fiction that
the American dream. Yeah, it's carrying
Go ahead.
much water, so many pails for the elite by like kind of deluding people into thinking like, oh, they too might be a billionaire someday.
Right, exactly. So it's that fiction that keeps people going and into it, which is why these think pieces. That's the kind of rhetorical, ideological work they're doing. Part of the fiction and conceit of these tech elites talking about this fortress of a fortress ideology is that they might be saying like, oh, in our AI robotic world, there's going to be no need for service workers or whatever. But what they're not saying is that they do still want and imagine a very stratified world. But what they want are gates around Hayes Valley so that you cannot enter. So that's part of the fiction. So going to refugee landlords really quick in the hyperghetto. So like Srinivasan's imaginary, the fortress ideology, will still have a hyperghetto in it. In fact, I think most of the world in their imagination will be fortress or a hyperghetto, right?
Yeah, there's a whole other like string here that I should do a whole episode on, which is like the Hindu nationalism aspect and the caste system and how that, like specifically with Balaji, plays into his vision of a world of very stratified by class.
Oh, totally, 100%. And it goes back to like the homeland politics and the right wing Modi regime and how they're like in bed with like the Zionists and all this like IDF soldiers go to like India for vacation now. But anyway, beyond that, so the existence of this world of hyper ghettos, which is the imaginary of the fortress ideology of the Silicon Valley, Bay Area, that's not being talked about. It creates opportunities for refugee landlords because there will be landlords in these worlds. And refugees can become landlords. Most do not because it's just out of access, but some refugees do come with capital or are able to make that happen, and they reproduce this exploitative relation onto others. And you see in hyperghettos, especially ghettos and hyperghettos, that refugees will end up in these places as first, second, third place of resettlement. And so in these sites, if there are refugees, there will be refugee landlords. So let's get into Airbnb. So Airbnb, Airbnb.org. So, how refugee landlords connects to Airbnb here is if there are landlords, there are refugee landlords. If there are refugee landlords, there will be Airbnb rentals. And so all this together creates this discourse of what the home is and how it gets deployed and the different violence of housing as commodity gets covered up by, certain narratives about refugee landlords and what they do with them. But part of this, narrative that I'm working with is what Airbnb.org does with this conversation of mass displacement. So Airbnb.org is the nonprofit arm of Airbnb, the corporation. Airbnb, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, is a platform, is a corporation that does rentals or coordinates short-term rentals with landlords and people looking for places to stay, right? And so Airbnb.org is the nonprofit arm that seeks to place temporarily displaced people into one of these Airbnb listings. This project began in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in, I think that was 2012, when Hurricane Sandy produced all these people who needed temporary housing. And so, at least how the narrative goes, according to Airbnb.org and Airbnb.com, the corporation, is that there was one host who had this willingness out of the goodness of their heart to say, oh, let me house some of these people for free. And then that expanded out to other initiatives where Airbnb, the corporation, would do these like short initiatives that would seek out or be targeted by people working in a particular disaster region or emergency, and work with them to coordinate people who need temporary housing with these listings, right? And so on the Airbnb side, they would coordinate with these organizations who are working with people on the ground and be like, hey, we need help finding housing for these people. And Airbnb would be like, okay, let me contact X many people in your targeted area and then see if they'd be willing to list their thing for free or whatever, or
Because,
for a reduced price.
And, thinking about it on the like Airbnb landlord or like listing side, like, I mean, your place is going to be empty. You just went through a hurricane, or in other cases, like you're dealing with, Airbnb in the West Bank, might might not be getting a lot of, sort of people wanting to rent at this moment in time because of the genocide and conflict. But yeah, sorry, please go on.
Yeah, precisely. I think you bring up a really important point here. So, let's say normally on the lister side, the landlord side, that perhaps they had a property or a surplus home is really one of the concerns here in these areas that are contested, right? Whether it's political, like, the West Bank, or environmental, and, those are all both combined as well. And so they can't find a long-term renter there. So what they do is they list it on Airbnb, right, or some other short-term rental sites, and continue to generate profit and value out of it, and continue to keep it out of people's hands who would otherwise should have them. And even if they don't do that, then Airbnb.org in a moment of crisis can go and help them house a refugee and feel better about it or something like that. So Airbnb.org, the nonprofit that like coordinates these like disaster relief or disaster emergency kind of situations, it registered as a nonprofit in 2000. So after like 8 years or so of doing these like short initiatives or whatever, they finally registered as like a formal nonprofit in 2000, where their primary job is to be working in these sites. So you see them doing things like working with wildfire locations, tornadoes, landslides, et cetera, et cetera. And before that, they would do things like, like for example, with Pulse, they would coordinate with folks to offer temporary housing to people who were trying to identify loved ones' remains or something like that.
The shooting, in Florida.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And so, what you see is Airbnb.org becomes a way to kind of humanitarian wash its entire operations.
Totally. Yeah, and you have to just know that, like, if a corporation is starting a nonprofit wing, they have done the math. They're not going to be losing any money on it because they know that the sort of like marketing value of that endeavor, of this nonprofit endeavor, like, is going to outweigh whatever, monetary costs it might be.
Absolutely. It would absolutely outweigh everything. And really, it's the host who takes on a lot of the liability. This is not a defense of the host, but this is more of a strategy for the nonprofit wing and the corporation.
Yeah.
It allows them a lot of security and risk management in this schematic.
Yeah, and because we have to remember, like, any of these apps that have now just become a part of our everyday, like Airbnb, like Uber. I mean, they're just the middle kind of person. They're not the ones that own any of the property. They don't. The risk is, as much as they might offer insurance, the bigger risk is with of course, like the people who's driving the Uber or who's renting out the Airbnb.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, I feel like that brings us to the next question there, which is like, how does it present itself, Airbnb.org, as like a problem? How does Airbnb kind of present the problem, and then Airbnb.org solves it?
Yeah. So, I'll speak about this in the context of refugees in particular, which at least, formally defined are mass displaced populations crossing like an international border, right? Um, so Airbnb.org, again, which is a nonprofit wing that seeks to do like disaster slash emergency assistance, works with certain particular organizations that do refugee placements and refugee resettlements, and works with them to offer temporary stays on otherwise Airbnb listed uh, ho- locations and shelters, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, let's use the 2021 sunsetting of U.S. occupation in Afghanistan. Right, that produced a lot of Afghan refugees, and the United States took in a decent amount of them. And the steps of how this would go in the past is the United States would designate a certain amount of refugees coming in from a certain place. They would work with a different set of, or fund a whole different set of NGOs, nonprofits, religious organizations, philanthropic organizations to do like the direct services, connect them to programs and housing, et cetera, et cetera. So housing is a big part of that. So where do these people live? Before things like Airbnb and these other platforms, these organizations would, do the housing placements on their own. They would have a running list of people they know. They would have existing partnerships. They would create a set of volunteers that they know and vet them and place their clients in through that way. These refugees, Airbnb, with the expansion of housing as commodity, as surplus homes being a hoarded thing that a lot of people have, it's been increasingly more and more difficult to place refugees into temporary housing, right? Because there's just a low stock of existing housing or even dignified housing, because otherwise those homes are now put on Airbnb or Booking.com or these other temporary stay listings. And so these landlords would find a much better profit doing those things. And so with Airbnb, it industrializes that process. It industrializes the process of renting out something, or turning a surplus home into a profit generating machine and mechanism. And so Airbnb.org is part of creating that problem of where to stay to begin with. So it presents itself as a solution for the problem it created by being like, oh, we will work with these Airbnb hosts and connect them to refugees or organizations who have refugees to house, right? And so that's how it presents itself as the solution to the problem it created to begin with.
And then on top of that, it's creating, I mean, in ways, yeah. So it's creating more of a problem for local populations wherever the Airbnb is located by taking housing off the market, making things more expensive. But at the same time, for the people who can get in on the Airbnb, I don't want to say like grift, but the who have it like that, so that they have all this extra space that they can now list or become entrepreneur, like mini mom and pop landlords that the real estate industry loves to point to as like a marketing tactic to sort of direct people's attention to, instead of the corporate landlords, or like they they're acting as like a marketing tactic for this industry that is not that popular, and needs needs all of the good PR that it can get.
Right, exactly. So, Airbnb.org becomes a way to rehab or attempts to rehabilitate the image of this surplus homeowner on Airbnb or Booking.com, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I point to Airbnb quite a bit, it operates as like the avatar, kind of like the most obvious case of these platform-mediated industrialization of commodified housing. There are so many other different corporations and platforms that do very similar things. So those need to be part of the conversation of like producing this too.
Mr. B&B.
Mr. B&B, yes, exactly. So we can bring in, the gays as well.
Right.
Who are a major part of this, especially
sure.
because they're all touring. They're part of the tourist economy everywhere, which produces displacement in so many places, especially Palestine. So we'll talk about that later. But yes, it becomes like a really great form of PR to rehabilitate the image of the surplus home hoarder, and it allows it allows the corporation and its landlords to present themselves as, look, we do care about providing shelter and housing. This is where the romantic anti-capitalism idea comes in really helpful for me, because we know that housing, when it is formed into a commodity, is defined both by the concrete and the abstract. So the concrete uses that this is a thing that provides shelter to people, right? This fulfills a direct human need, what Marx refers to as a use value. But the way that it operates under capitalism as a commodity, the way that it's alienated from people, is that it's also primarily at this point, in the stage of capitalism that we're in, as a thing that produces value. It produces wealth, it produces capital for people. And that is what people are doing when they're and that's the abstract part of it, right? That people kind of misrecognize. So what Airbnb is doing, and the people who are listing their surplus homes on it, is that they're in pursuit of seeing housing as capital, right? And so to put it on Airbnb.org, to give it to a refugee temporarily, allows the fiction of, oh no, this housing that we're doing, we're providing a shelter. We are providing a very concrete use thing. We're doing something that is really anti-capitalist and wonderful, when that is not absolutely the case whatsoever, because the relation is still there. At best, the refugee or the displaced person or the person who needs the temporary stay is in there for like, a week max or a month maximum, and then they're displaced, and then that house goes back onto the market. So it's all smoke and mirrors, and it just reproduces the housing problem to begin with, while attempting to rehabilitate the image of the landlord.
Yeah, and then I don't know if this was the case with Airbnb.org, maybe but like with Uber and Lyft during past like sort of like emergencies during early on in the pandemic, when people were like going to get their vaccines, like I believe it was Uber maybe, or both of them, Uber and Lyft partnered with the city of San Francisco to get people free rides to and from getting a vaccine. This great humanitarian act during a time when, nobody was trying to get in an Uber during that time period anyways. So, like drivers were out of work. But in any case, the city was in part subsidizing that. It wasn't just Uber reaching into its own pockets, billion-dollar valuation company wasn't having to foot all the bills, but it was getting great PR for doing this at a time when presenting itself as like the solution to an emergency.
Yeah, precisely. Like Airbnb.org and these temporary stay projects are that are done by these in platform capital mediations of the industrialization of commodified housing. They don't just target or frame their PR or work with people who are directly affected by these crises. So it's not just the refugees, the people who are displaced, but first responders is the term they use. So volunteer first responders, people who do that for their full time, nurses, frontline emergency techs, um, all these different folks who need to be mobilized in a particular place to do the work. And that, similar to this Uber example that you're giving, allows Airbnb to frame itself, or Airbnb.org to frame its operations, and larger than that, the whole operation of industrialized commodified housing as a positive thing. That it covers it up, but also is like, look, we're here to provide this material, concrete thing for people in need. Well, firstly, to look beyond that, we have to understand that this would not be a problem to begin with if there weren't, industrialized commodified housing or commodified housing to begin with. And it's also going back to this fantasy of like the fortress ideology of the Bay Area, which is very much so exported out of Silicon Valley as a general framework, right? Which is, oh, look, we actually still do need first responders, but they have to live outside of the fortress. And then we can do some Airbnb.org stuff, let them temporarily in here if there's like, an earthquake or like a flood that happens inside the fortress. They can come in temporarily, and Airbnb will help us with that. So again, it's like with these fortress ideologies, with the creation of these hyperghettos, it's this imagination that every solution is created by the condition itself. Every fantasy is rooted, as much as utopic as it might sound, is rooted in these reproductions of capitalist exploitations and forms, these neoliberal policies. It's imagining a world that is incredibly stratified and eugenicist, and it doesn't want you in it. You kind of broadly conceived. And it presents itself as that solution, and the solution is turning to the market, turning to capitalized, commodified forms in order to address or alleviate temporarily the problem that they created to begin with.
Yes, so well put. Do you mind if I go to the bathroom real quick?
And then yeah, go ahead.
And we could talk about West Bank, and then just like one more question.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sweet. Tight. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So the next question that I had for you, sorry, let me start again there, Tyger. So yeah, I mean, I think you do an amazing job of showing how the refugee landlord becomes a kind of like a stooge for Airbnb, and works in Airbnb's favor in all of these ways. I also wanted to talk as a sort of a side about an adjacent topic, Airbnb's West Bank operations in Palestine. And it has been in the past, Airbnb, as it is now, I believe, a BDS target, boycott, divestment, sanctions target, because of its continued operations in Palestine. And to the point where, Airbnb has had to come out and make statements about how it is against BDS and how it will know Airbnb has no intentions of removing listings from the settlements in the West Bank. Let's see. It has, however, felt the pressure enough of being a BDS target, I suppose, and having to like answer for why are you continuing to operate in this very contested area. They've somewhat recently updated their language around this, but they say any profits generated for Airbnb by any Airbnb host activity in the entire West Bank will be donated to nonprofit organizations dedicated to humanitarian aid that will serve people in different parts of the world. I assume none of that is going to Palestinians. Brian Chesky, the Airbnb founder and head, is very much a Zionist, is not shy about that. They are also implementing the same approach for listings in South Ossetia. I am butchering the pronunciation of these. Ossetia and Abkhazia, two other disputed areas where the company has previously announced that we would take action. I think that those are in relation to the to Russia, part of Russia, I believe. I will double check that. Airbnb has always opposed the BDS movement. Airbnb has never boycotted Israeli businesses or the more than 20,000 Israeli hosts who are active on the platform. We've always sought to bring people together and will continue to work with our community to achieve this goal. And you know, you also see like a similar thing happening with Uber in places where the taxi lobby or the taxi, like the labor unions around taxi drivers are strong enough to where like the state has said, no, we don't want Uber to come in and privatize all of the taxi service here. Places like Thailand, Japan. Uber exists. Uber is in these places, has an app so that people who are from the US who are familiar with the Uber app can open it up and request a cab. And I think it's probably partially so that Uber can start to familiarize itself with local populations so that when it is able to make inroads in the government to you know, fend off the labor unions, you know, it will already have the digital infrastructure and the familiarity like with the local populations to get like, you know, taken up real quick. That's another side. But so like by continuing to operate in the West Bank and with each donation that it makes to these nonprofits that are named obviously on the site, presumably, you know, it's going to engender positive feelings towards Airbnb, while at the same time potentially like, you know, keeping competition out of those areas so that like Mr. B&B can't slide in and take those listings that you know, Airbnb currently has. Yeah, just wondering if you might speak to how Airbnb's West Bank operations are kind of implicated in the ideas that you're speaking about in the paper.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. So, you know, as you mentioned, in 2018, Airbnb actually delisted their West Bank listings, and they had quite a few in West Bank and other illegally occupied territories. And you know, to the credit of the BDS movement and others, Airbnb did respond, which I think is a win. In an interest, it's like okay, they were putting enough pressure so that they had to like say something. So that was a really interesting point there. They Airbnb reversed that decision after they were immediately sued by actors both in the United States and Israel around that. So I haven't read the details of that particular lawsuit, but it was enough to get them to reverse their decision. And so they relisted those listings in the West Bank in particular. And that prompted them to produce this, you know, revised wording and policy, as you highlight, as a way to kind of liberalize or universalize what they will or won't do. And it seems like they're making some kind of blanket statement around, oh, we're not going to, you know, work in particular territories. And, you know, when we do, we're going to donate all the profits to like a nonprofit. So, you know, the reality is that the nonprofit, all the proceeds do not go to a nonprofit. So they still generate like 20% of those listings like as income for them. And they donate like a certain amount of it to a nonprofit called the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is like located in Australia. So I haven't had a chance to look too much into that particular institute. So, maybe that's like a topic for a different time. But they appear like a think tank that does some kind of, research, et cetera, et cetera. I can't tell whether they, well, the point is, okay, you can revise that however you want. Tyger, you can do that. The main point is, as you said, the money is not going to Palestinians. Right. So that's absolutely not happening. And it's being robbed from Palestinians in multiple ways. And, we see this especially happening after October 2023, because the listings in the West Bank actually triple folded since then. And so like the Airbnb listings, the booking.com listings, all these different short-term rental corporations had like 100 or something before October 2023. Afterwards, they're up to like, upper 300s, up to 400. And this is all part of the project of sustaining tourism and normalizing the settler colonial project in these illegally occupied territories. It invites people to come and imagine what life would be if the illegally occupied territory were completely cleansed of Palestinians. If Palestinians were completely produce this idea of, the Zionist project in full completion to give people a good, desirable, leisurely experience. And that's what many of these Airbnb listings kind of frame themselves as. And this is a big part of like the rhetoric and why the rhetoric and narrative and fantasies are so critical to reproducing settler colonialism and Zionism. It normalizes these projects. It makes them enticing. It makes them fantastical. And it provides the material context of that in terms of like housing. So, not only is it housing and land that is taken away from Palestinians, but it's also producing profits for the corporation, for the landlords, and also normalizing the settler colonial project and painting Zionism in a way that is pleasurable and exciting to tourist eyes and the world's eyes. So, the really egregious thing to me is many parts of it, but especially since the intensification of the genocide in October 2023, the listings have actually increased in the West Bank and other illegally occupied territories.
Beautifully put. Yeah. I think that might actually be all the questions that I had for you. Before I let you go, though, like, is there a way that people can check out this piece?
This piece is not published yet. It's still in process. So, pray for me that I will get this done at some point.
Cool.
But it's nearly done, and hopefully it finds a home somewhere.
Cool. Yeah. Well, it is very, very thought-provoking and right on time, I feel like. Yeah, thank you so much, Trung. Is there a way for people to follow your work?
Yeah. If people want to check out, and keep updated with what I'm doing, they can check out my website, which is tpqn.org.
Tight. Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/SadFrancisco. You're making it possible for Sad Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/SadFrancisco.